Hey guys, tonight we journey deep into medieval Europe. Not to admire its castles or chivalry, but to uncover something lonelier, more unsettling. While the Middle Ages gave us cathedrals, guilds, and legends, they also created a world where lacking a surname could erase your identity entirely. From being barred from guilds to dying with no record you ever existed. Life without a last name was harsher than you might imagine. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like this video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy these explorations. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now dim the lights, and let's step into this hidden past together. You were known by your father's first name only. Imagine yourself standing on a rutted village road in the pale light of dawn. All around you, the day begins its slow unfolding. The lowing of cattle waiting to be driven to pasture, the soft clatter of pails carried to the well, the distant voices of women greeting one another by names that are both familiar and fleeting. In much of medieval Europe, a person's identity rested not on a fixed surname, but on a simple declaration of belonging. Son of Robert, daughter of Henry, wife of Thomas. These names linked each individual to a father, a household, and a lineage. A boy called John was known to all as John Robert's son. A girl named Agnes carried the identifier Agnes, Henry's daughter. In small communities, these names were enough to situate a person in the dense web of kinship and obligation. The rhythm of their lives was shaped by this constant reinforcement of connection. To be named was to be known. To be known was to be anchored in a place where everyone carried a story of who you came from, whose fields you helped to tend, whose hearth you returned to each evening. Imagine the sound of introductions in a busy market square. A young woman selling eggs might greet the miller as Thomas, son of Richard. A traveling mason would be announced to the reeve as Nicholas, son of Edmund. No written records were necessary. Memory and repetition kept these ties alive. Yet this naming carried a quiet vulnerability. The identity that proclaimed a person's belonging could also vanish in a moment if the father died, disappeared, or fell from favor. A child whose father left for war or crusade became harder to place. A family whose patriarch succumbed to illness could find themselves adrift. Their standing in the community diminished. Imagine the hush that followed a death in the household. Neighbors might gather to offer help, but as the days passed, questions inevitably arose. What will become of the children? Who will speak for them? Without the steady anchor of a father's name, identity became uncertain. For some, the loss was more than emotional. It was legal and economic too. A child's right to inherit, to work certain lands, or to claim protection depended on being recognized as someone's son or daughter. Among the poor, this fragility was especially stark. If a man died leaving no clear heir, the land he had farmed could revert to his lord. A widow might be allowed to remain if she could prove her husband's identity and her own connection to him. Otherwise, she and her children could be turned away, their names no longer carrying the weight of belonging. Even among wealthier families, names were rarely permanent. As communities grew and populations shifted, a new identifier might be added. A village name, a trade, a landmark. Over time, John, son of Robert, might become John at the mill or John Miller. But in the centuries before surnames settled into predictable forms, these transformations were gradual and inconsistent. A single person might be called by several variations in different records or remembered differently by neighbors. The rhythm of these changes could be bewildering. In towns where trade flourished, people moved more frequently, and names lost their anchoring power. A woman called Margaret, daughter of Simon in one village might be simply Margaret Simons in another, or even Margaret Widow if her husband had died along the road. Imagine a child growing up in this shifting landscape of names, hearing herself referred to by her father's name, her grandfather's, or by the place her family had last settled. Each variation was a reminder that her identity was never wholly her own. It was a tapestry woven of other people's lives and fortunes. This way of naming also underscored the importance of reputation. A father's deeds, good or ill, echoed in the way his children were addressed. To be known as son of a respected craftsman brought quiet advantages. A bit of trust extended in business dealings, a gentler tone from the reeve. To be marked as daughter of a man who owed debts or carried a poor reputation meant suspicion before a word was spoken. Among the nobility, names gradually acquired more permanence, but even there, lineage was proclaimed as much by association as by fixed surnames. A nobleman might be introduced as William, son of Geoffrey, lord of this or that manor. His children, in turn, bore those layered identifiers, each one both a claim and a burden. Imagine the way a simple name held the memory of generations. The grandfather who cleared new fields, the father who fought in distant wars, the uncle who squandered an inheritance. A child's identity was never only his own. It was a living record of his family's fortunes and failures. In church records, where births, marriages, and deaths were inscribed in careful Latin, the formula repeated with reassuring regularity. Agnes, daughter of Henry. John, son of Robert. When famine or plague came, these same names were crossed through. The brief notations of mortality, reminding the living that each name could vanish as quickly as it was recorded. Even in times of peace, the departure of a father could mean the unraveling of a family's place in the community. A man who left to seek work in another town might be gone for years, leaving his children to grow up identified only by absence. Thomas, whose father went away. This liminality carried a quiet stigma, an uncertainty about whether the family could claim the protections and rights that came with clear lineage. Imagine the evening after a day's work in the fields. A family gathered around a low table. The children repeat their names as they have heard them. Agnes, daughter of Henry. John, son of Robert. They do not yet understand how fragile these identities can be, how easily they can be lost to death, disgrace, or simple distance. It is a simple truth, repeated across centuries. Before the permanence of surnames, identity was a living thing, woven from the presence or absence of a father's name. The rhythm of their lives was shaped by this dependence on belonging, by the quiet fear that the name which situated a person among neighbors could vanish overnight. Even now, in the hush of a village long forgotten, you can almost hear the echo of those names, spoken by mothers at the hearth, recorded by priests in cold script, murmured by neighbors who measured each person by the name of the man who came before them. The rhythm endures, a testament to lives once bound by lineage as much as by love, and to the fragile connections that gave each child a place in the world. You couldn't own land without a traceable family name. Imagine yourself in a small village, the roofs of the cottages sagging under the weight of years, the air scented with damp earth, and the slow smoke of peat fires. In this place, everything you could see, fields, hedgerows, the paths winding between stone walls, belonged to someone. But ownership was not simply a matter of planting your flag or building a house. For much of history, to possess land, you needed something more elusive, a name that could be traced across generations. A family name was more than a label. It was the living proof that you belonged somewhere, that your ancestors had stood on this soil before you. In societies where oral memory and fragile records were the only safeguards of property rights, lineage determined whether your claim could survive a challenge. A surname was a shield against uncertainty, a reassurance that you were not simply passing through. Consider how easily this fragile claim could vanish. If your parents died before you came of age and left no surviving records, your right to remain in your home became questionable. Neighbors or distant relations might dispute your inheritance, arguing that no proof existed that you were the rightful heir. Without witnesses willing to stand up in court or a church ledger naming your family, your word alone carried little weight. Imagine the chill that must have settled over a person summoned before the local steward, or the manorial court. The hall would be dim, its walls lined with rough benches. A scribe sat at a table, quill poised, ready to record each uncertain answer. What is your family name? Whose son or daughter are you? Who can swear to it? Every question was a test of belonging. If you hesitated or contradicted yourself, the steward's frown deepened. A single omission, a forgotten date, an absent witness, could unravel the story that anchored you to your land. In many places, surnames evolved precisely to meet these needs. A man might be known by his father's name, John Richardson, meaning John, son of Richard, or by his occupation, Thomas Weaver, or by the village where he was born, Alice of Hawford. Over time, these descriptions solidified into surnames, a way of linking each generation to the last in a chain that could be pointed to, recited, and written down. Yet even a surname did not guarantee security. To hold property, you often needed a document, sometimes a deed, sometimes a charter, sometimes a record inscribed in the great ledger of a noble estate. These records were fragile things. A flood, a fire, or a sudden death could scatter them beyond recovery. Without them, your claim became only as strong as the memories of your neighbors. Imagine the rhythm of a life built on such uncertainty. A farmer who rose each morning to tend fields he had worked for decades might still fear the day a distant relative arrived to contest his rights. A widow whose husband had died without leaving a written will might see her children's inheritance slip away because she could not produce the proper witness or the needed scrap of parchment. In some regions, especially where populations shifted frequently due to war, famine, or economic need, these problems became even more acute. Families on the margins of society, people who moved from one tenancy to another, or laborers who never had a settled surname at all, often found themselves with no legal foothold. Their homes could be claimed by wealthier neighbors, their fields reallocated by local lords, all because no one could recite the lineage that proved they belonged. Over time, authorities attempted to impose order. Kings and nobles commissioned surveys and censuses to establish who held what land and by what right. Clerks with ink-stained fingers traveled from village to village, recording names, relationships, and boundaries in ledgers that were stored, often precariously, in wooden chests or castle archives. These surveys were meant to protect ownership and taxation alike, but they also created new anxieties. A misspelled surname or an incorrect entry could set off years of dispute. Imagine a man standing in a crowded hall, listening as a scribe read out a list of names. When his own was mangled or left off entirely, he would feel a sinking dread. No amount of protest could fully repair the omission. In that moment, land that had passed from father to son could be reclassified, seized, or redistributed. Yet for many people, the greatest fear was not formal eviction, but the slow erosion of belonging. Without a recognized family name, you might work the same fields for decades and still be spoken of as an outsider, someone who had no true claim to the earth beneath your feet. Even neighbors who treated you kindly would remember, in the quiet moments, that your presence rested on uncertain ground. Still, amid this precariousness, people found ways to endure. They forged alliances through marriage, gathered witnesses to swear to their rights, and taught their children the stories that anchored their lineage. The recounting of names became an evening ritual, as important as any prayer, a defense against the slow forgetfulness that could erase generations of labor in a single dispute. This was the rhythm of their lives, a constant effort to prove they belonged, to stitch their identities into the records and memories of their communities. Though modern systems of property law and official registries have largely replaced these fragile arrangements, the traces remain. We still look to documents, signatures, and names to confirm what feels self-evident: that our lives and labors leave a mark, that the places we care for can in some way be ours. As you drift into thought, you can picture those quiet cottages, the narrow fields, and the men and women who rose each morning to claim their place in a world where belonging was never simple. Their stories remind us that even the simplest things, a patch of land, a family name, were once defended with patience, memory, and the quiet hope that, in the end, no one would question that you were meant to be there. The church could refuse to record your baptism. Imagine yourself in the dim interior of a medieval church, the air cool and heavy with the scent of beeswax and damp stone. Shafts of pale light filter through narrow windows, falling on flagstones worn smooth by centuries of feet. At the front, a priest in a faded cassock lifts a ledger bound in dark leather. A line of villagers waits quietly, each holding a baby swaddled in linen. They have come to have their children baptized, to secure their place in both the community and the eyes of God. In the medieval world, baptism was not simply a rite of passage. It was a profound moment that marked the child as part of the Christian fold. Without it, a baby remained spiritually exposed, unprotected from the unseen forces believed to hover at the edges of life. Yet baptism was also a legal event, a moment when a name was recorded, a lineage inscribed in ink. For many parents, this ceremony was both comforting and essential. It offered the hope of salvation and the practical assurance that the child would be recognized as a member of society. But for some, the path to that small measure of security was not so straightforward. Imagine a woman standing at the back of the church, her infant held tightly against her chest. She has no husband to stand beside her. Her child has no surname to offer when the priest asks. The woman lowers her gaze as murmurs ripple through the congregation. In some parishes, this uncertainty was enough to give the priest pause. It is a quiet truth often left out of romantic stories about medieval life. The church, for all its teachings of compassion, could refuse to baptize or record a child whose parentage was unclear. If the mother could not name the father, or if the child's legitimacy was questioned, the priest might delay or deny the entry in the register. To be left unrecorded was more than an inconvenience. The baptismal register was the cornerstone of a person's legal existence. It established proof of birth and belonging. Without it, a child could struggle to inherit property, to claim protection, or to marry within the church. A soul unbaptized was believed to hover in peril, spiritually incomplete. Picture the priest turning the pages of a ledger, the script precise and unhurried. Each name carefully entered, each parent listed. The ink dries in the cold air. For most children, the record is secure. But for others, a blank space remains, a silent refusal that will echo through their lives. In some villages, local customs softened these rules. Neighbors might vouch for a mother, swearing that she was honest and her child deserving of baptism. A priest, moved by pity or pragmatism, might perform the rite quietly without recording it in the official book. But such mercy depended on the mood of the parish and the character of the priest. The consequences of omission could be profound. An unbaptized child was often buried in unconsecrated ground if they died young. Families believed this left the soul vulnerable, unable to enter the peaceful rest promised to the faithful. Even among the living, the stigma clung to the child as they grew. An unspoken question about who they were and whether they truly belonged. Imagine, now, a mother returning home with her baby still unbaptized. The cottage feels colder than before, the shadows longer. She tells herself she will return next week, or perhaps the week after, when she has found someone willing to speak on her behalf. In the meantime, she watches her child sleep, wondering if each breath will last until dawn. These uncertainties were not confined to the very poor. Even small landowners could find themselves caught in the tangle of rules and expectations. If a father died before the child was born, leaving no witnesses to claim paternity, the family might struggle to secure a place in the record. Church authorities believed they were protecting the sacrament's dignity. The careful documentation of lineage and legitimacy upheld social order. Yet in doing so, they also created a quiet class of the spiritually and legally invisible, children whose only fault was the circumstances of their birth. Over time, some regions began to relax these strictures. Bishops issued directives urging priests to baptize all children without delay. Local councils sometimes provided funds to support poor mothers so they could offer the modest fees required for the ceremony. But even then, suspicion lingered. A name without a surname remained a mark that could follow a person all their life. If you let your imagination drift further, picture the moment when a record was finally made. The mother standing in her best shawl, her hands trembling as the priest dipped the quill. The infant drowsy with warmth as water touched their forehead. A small, almost imperceptible sigh as the final flourish of ink secured their place in the book. And in the world, these baptismal registers were more than lists. They were, in a sense, the first official acknowledgement that a life mattered, that a soul was counted among the living. To be excluded was a wound deeper than most could admit. Even centuries later, genealogists find traces of these lost names, gaps in the record where a life should have been inscribed. Each blank space is a quiet testament to the frailty of belonging in a society where legitimacy was measured in ink and witness. So as you let your thoughts settle now, imagine the hush that filled the church after each baptism, the slow closing of the ledger, the faint echo of footsteps on worn flagstones. Imagine how many mothers walked home with both relief and sorrow, knowing that acceptance came not from love alone, but from the willingness of others to record it. And in that hush, you can sense the vast tapestry of small, ordinary lives, some remembered, some quietly erased, each one woven into the history that shaped the world we know today. You were barred from guilds and apprenticeships. Imagine yourself in a narrow street lined with timbered shops, their signs creaking in the wind. The morning light catches on brass scales and polished wood, the proud displays of work that proclaimed a craftsman's skill to anyone passing by. Behind every door, the rhythm of hammers, chisels, and looms created a quiet music of industry. Yet for all the life that filled these lanes, there was an invisible threshold that many could never cross. In the cities and towns of medieval Europe, guilds were the guardians of craft. They were more than trade associations. They were brotherhoods, social safety nets, and gatekeepers of reputation. To join a guild was to step into a lineage that connected you to generations of artisans. It meant that your work would be recognized as legitimate, your tools protected, your name respected. But that door did not open for everyone. If your birth could not be traced to a legitimate household, if no father stood ready to attest to your name, you were not simply overlooked. You were actively barred. To the guild, you were a wanderer, a rootless figure whose place in society was uncertain. No matter how deft your hands or eager your mind, you carried the shadow of origin wherever you went. Imagine a boy of 12, standing at the threshold of a carpenter's workshop. His palms are rough from gathering wood scraps, his eyes fixed on the smooth boards and gleaming tools within. He feels a restless yearning. If only he could be taken on as an apprentice, learn a skill, claim a place in this ordered world. But when the master inquires after his family, there is no lineage to recite, no document to prove his parentage. The master shakes his head, not unkindly, and sends him away. These moments happened quietly, again and again. Guild statutes were precise. An apprentice must be of honest birth, a phrase that carried all the weight of centuries of custom. It did not matter whether a child had been raised with care and discipline, whether he had survived poverty and hardship. Without a recognized father's name, the door stayed closed. The exclusion was practical as much as social. Guilds protected the reputation of their craft. A craftsman's mark stamped on a piece of ironwork or cloth guaranteed its quality. If anyone could join, the guild's power to set standards and prices would weaken. Limiting membership to those of proven families helped preserve that control. In this way, economic self-interest and social prejudice reinforced each other. For a child denied apprenticeship, life narrowed quickly. Without training, there was little hope of rising beyond unskilled labor. You might work as a porter, hauling barrels and sacks for a few coins, or you might find day labor on farms and in markets, where no questions were asked but no security offered. You learned to carry your tools on your back and your skill in your hands, moving from one place to the next. Imagine the rhythm of such a life. The long walks between villages, the cautious approach to each new settlement, the quiet calculation of where you might be allowed to stay. In an era when reputation was everything, your lack of lineage meant you were always a stranger, always at the edge of respectability. Some tried to circumvent the rules by offering payment to a master willing to look the other way. A few found patrons who intervened on their behalf, issuing letters that vouched for their character. But these exceptions were rare and often precarious. If the arrangement was discovered, the master could be fined or expelled from the guild, and the apprentice dismissed. Over time, the rigidity of these customs began to soften. In larger cities, demand for skilled labor sometimes outpaced the supply of properly born apprentices. Practical need created small cracks in the walls of exclusion. By the later Middle Ages, some guilds allowed entry to foundlings or illegitimate children if they had been raised in good households or could prove their worth. But for many centuries, the prejudice remained deeply rooted. Imagine the interior of a guild hall, its beams darkened by centuries of smoke. At the long table, masters deliberate over petitions, apprenticeship contracts, and disputes. The names they read are carefully inscribed, each traced to fathers and grandfathers. The boy who waits outside the door is invisible to these records. His ambition is no less real, but the written lineage he lacks defines what is possible. Yet even among those denied formal apprenticeship, ingenuity found a way. Some became itinerant craftsmen, learning their trade in fragments, watching, imitating, practicing until skill outweighed suspicion. Others worked in unregulated trades, mending pots, sharpening blades, or weaving baskets. They were never fully accepted, but in the margins of the economy, they carved out a living. As you reflect on this, consider how much of history was shaped by such quiet exclusions. For every name recorded in a guild ledger, there were countless others who labored unseen, their work unmarked by official seals, but necessary all the same. And as you drift toward rest or contemplation, you might picture the young apprentice who never was, standing in the doorway of a workshop. The air smells of sawdust and oil, the sounds of craft continuing without him. In his hands he holds a small wooden carving, the product of long hours stolen between chores. It is imperfect, perhaps, but it is his own. In the rhythm of their lives, denied, determined, and resourceful, there is a quiet testament to endurance. Though the guilds closed their doors, the work of human hands continued in all the spaces no record ever captured. Orphans were branded with their occupation instead. Imagine yourself in the narrow lane of a medieval town, just after dawn. The cobblestones are slick with the residue of last night's rain, and the air is thick with a mingled sense of damp straw, yeast from early bread baking, and the faint tang of smoke drifting from kitchen hearths. Here, in this place where every house bears the mark of its trade, a carved sign or a painted emblem, children slip in and out of doorways, carrying baskets or leading livestock. Among them are those whose names do not come from family or lineage, but from the work they have been given. These were the children who had no inheritance but labor. Orphans, in many parts of medieval Europe, were not always granted the dignity of their parents' names. Instead, they were assigned identities that reflected their occupation. Thomas the baker, Will the herd, Joan the spinner. The names served as a kind of permanent label, tethering them to the role society expected them to fill. To understand this, you have to picture the world they inhabited. Life was arranged in careful hierarchies. Names were more than simple labels. They were signifiers of belonging, heritage, and standing. A surname could trace a line back through generations, connecting a child to a village or a trade guild. But when parents died, through plague, war, or simple misfortune, children lost not only care and affection, but the social anchor that a family name provided. In some communities, the local parish or manor assumed responsibility for orphans. Officials might gather them into communal care. An almshouse, a monastery, or, more often, apprenticeship under a master craftsman or farmer. From that moment on, the child's name became both a record and a sentence. A small boy who swept the mill floors became Robin the Miller. A girl who carded wool until her fingertips were raw became Alice the Carder. Imagine a young boy, no more than 7 or 8, standing at the threshold of a bakehouse. The air inside is warm, heavy with the sweet smell of rising dough and the sharper tang of wood smoke. He holds a small broom in his hand, watching the baker knead heavy rounds of bread on a floured table. To the townsfolk who pass by, he is Thomas the Baker. Not because he owns the bakehouse, but because he has no other name. This renaming was, in some ways, an administrative convenience. It allowed church records to track each child's obligations and the household responsible for them. But it also served as a quiet reminder of status. To be branded by your occupation was to be told that your life would never stretch beyond those narrow expectations. Picture the rhythm of their days. At dawn, they rose to tend animals, to fetch water, to stir great vats of dye or pound grain into flour. Their meals were simple: coarse bread, small pieces of cheese or dried peas. At night, they slept in lofts or on straw pallets, often in the same buildings where they worked. Over time, the repetitive labor shaped them physically and quietly impressed itself upon their sense of identity. For many of these children, the renaming marked the beginning of a lifelong cycle of work. An apprentice might eventually rise to journeyman status, but few escaped the station into which they had been set. Without a family to advocate for them, there were no dowries or inheritances, no parcels of land to claim. Their names were a constant, soft-spoken reminder. You belong to this trade and nothing more. Even so, small kindnesses could be found in the spaces between labor. Imagine a moment late in the day, when the miller's wife offers a cup of warm broth to the boy who has swept flour from the stones. Or an evening when the blacksmith's apprentice slips a bit of scrap iron into a child's palm, encouraging a small experiment. In these gestures, a measure of humanity emerged, reminding orphans that their worth was not solely measured by what they produced. Over time, some of these occupational surnames became so entrenched they passed down to the next generation. What began as a mark of servitude hardened into a fixed identity. In parish rolls, you can trace the line of names. John the Carter's children became Carters in their own right. Thomas the Baker's descendants were known simply as bakers. The occupational label that began as a necessity eventually merged with tradition, blending practicality and quiet resignation. Imagine walking through a churchyard centuries later. The stones lean against one another, their inscriptions softened by wind and moss. Among them, you find simple markers: William Hurd, Alice Spinner, Thomas Baker. Names that carry no hint of a parent, no memory of a clan. The markers are modest, but they are evidence that these lives were witnessed, however briefly. In rare cases, an orphan might rise beyond the label. Some found a patron willing to sponsor their training or education, or earned enough through diligence to acquire land. But for most, the cycle remained unbroken. Their identities were never entirely their own, shaped instead by the demands of survival and the quiet, unrelenting expectations of the communities that took them in. Yet it is worth remembering that even within this system, Small acts of resistance and selfhood endured. A child might carve a secret mark onto a doorframe, or whisper stories about parents they could barely remember. In this way, they claimed a measure of continuity, even when the world insisted they were defined only by what they did. When you picture the past, let yourself linger on these smaller histories. The quiet persistence of identity in the face of anonymity. The resilience required to accept a name that was never freely chosen. Imagine a dawn when a child, carrying a basket of bread or a pail of milk, looked up into the widening light and allowed themselves, for a moment, to believe they were more than a label. And so, the story of orphans branded by their occupation is not only a tale of loss, it is also a testament to endurance. The slow, steady determination to find meaning in a life defined by necessity, to carve out moments of quiet dignity in a world that too often reduced children to the rhythm of their labor. You were considered a servant until proven otherwise. Imagine yourself in a narrow lane bordered by timber houses whose upper stories lean inward so closely you could almost touch both walls with outstretched hands. The morning is cool, the air carrying the scent of damp straw and hearth smoke. Here, in the heart of a feudal town, every passerby is measured first not by their face or their trade, but by the single question that lingers in every mind. To whom do you belong? For in this world, the absence of a surname was not a blank space to be filled by choice. It was a marker, a quiet declaration that you were of uncertain standing. In many towns and villages, those who could not claim a family name were presumed to be servants, serfs, or slaves. It did not matter whether you were skilled, honest, or industrious. Your status clung to you more insistently than any reputation you could build. The rhythm of their lives was shaped by this unspoken assumption. A young man who introduced himself as simply Thomas was immediately judged by omission. Thomas of where? Thomas son of whom? If no answer followed, the listener made their own conclusions. To have no surname was to exist in a narrow corridor of possibility. To be regarded as a dependent, a worker attached to another household, someone whose life could be directed by the will of another. Imagine approaching a market stall, your coin in hand. The seller's eyes flick first to your clothing, coarse homespun, unadorned, and then to the way you name yourself. If you could name a father of some standing, or a place with known rights, you might be granted a measure of respect. If you could not, your word carried less weight. Even your honesty was suspect. This hierarchy was woven through every part of the community. In records kept by clerks and priests, surnames marked those with land or status. The rest were noted with brief phrases. John, servant to the reeve, or Alice, bonded woman in the household of the miller. These identifications were not always permanent. Status could shift if fortune changed, but they were sticky, persisting long after circumstances improved. Imagine the quiet injustice of such assumptions. A skilled carpenter's apprentice, whose parents were unfree tenants, might one day master his craft. Yet in the eyes of his neighbors, he remained John the bondsman, his work always viewed as the property of another. Even if he earned enough to dress well, or by his own tools, the absence of a surname was a silent reproach, a reminder that he had yet to prove his worth. Among women, the burden was often heavier still. A girl born to a serf mother might never be addressed by any name other than Margaret the maid. Her labor could be demanded by her lord or mistress as a matter of right. Marriage might bring a shift in status, but until then, she moved through the town with the unspoken label of servitude, her own story eclipsed by inherited obligation. In some regions, this presumption extended beyond social life to the law itself. A person without a recognized surname found it harder to bring a case before court. Their testimony could be discounted, their grievances set aside. Legal protections often hinged on a clear identity tied to land or a household of good repute. Those who lacked such ties existed in a liminal space, not precisely invisible, but seldom heard. The rhythm of their lives was thus a continual negotiation. Each introduction became an opportunity to declare allegiance, to stake a small claim to dignity. Some tried to attach themselves to respected patrons, adopting a master's name as a mark of borrowed honor. A servant in a prosperous household might call herself Agnes of the baker, hoping the association would soften judgment. Others resigned themselves to anonymity, aware that no borrowed name could fully erase the stain of servitude. Imagine the cold formality of civic records, each line an account of ownership and hierarchy. William, bondman to the manor. Joan, slave born in the household of the reeve. These entries were terse, factual, and final. Whatever kindness or competence these people showed in their daily lives, the records only affirmed the simple truth. You were known by who owned your labor. In wealthier households, even a servant with no surname could sometimes attain a measure of respect if they managed estates or held specialized knowledge. A steward or bailiff might be addressed politely despite humble origins. Yet such exceptions were rare, and they depended on the continuing favor of those in power. The moment that favor wavered, old assumptions returned. Among the truly free, merchants, prosperous yeomen, minor gentry, having a surname was a quiet shield against this scrutiny. A family name proclaimed that you belonged to no one, that you were accountable only to your peers and the law. It was a luxury that many never enjoyed. Imagine a child growing up in this world of unspoken rules. Each morning, he heard his name called. Matthew, the servant's boy. Even his games were circumscribed by his status. He could play with the children of the household, but not presume too much familiarity. He could share meals, but always at the second table. In time, he learned to measure his words, to carry himself in a way that neither invited scorn nor presumed equality. And yet, within this rigid structure, there were small rebellions. A craftsman might teach his children to read, even if they were serfs. A mother might whisper family stories, giving her daughter a sense of identity no records could erase. A young man might save enough coin to buy freedom, though freedom itself could be precarious if the community refused to acknowledge it. The rhythm of their lives was shaped by this tension between status and aspiration. Every day offered reminders that you were judged first by where you came from, only second by what you could do. Even now, in the quiet corridors of forgotten towns, you can almost hear the measured voices of clerks recording each name, each station. The words were tidy and final. Servant, serf, bondwoman. But behind each label stood a life, full of quiet endurance and unrecorded worth. It is a simple truth, repeated across centuries. In feudal towns, your status was not something you declared. It was something presumed. The absence of a surname was a silent verdict. A verdict you spent your life striving to overturn. And even then, it was often others who decided whether you had succeeded. Surnames meant protection in court. Imagine yourself standing in a long, shadowed hall, the air thick with the smell of damp stone and old rushes. You hear the scrape of benches as people settle into their places. A small crowd has gathered. Neighbors, petitioners, a scribe with a sheaf of parchment balanced on his knee. At the far end, beneath the carved beam of the Lord's seat, a steward clears his throat and begins to call names. In many parts of the medieval world, to be named was the first step toward being heard. A surname was not only a mark of identity, it was a declaration of connection. It told the court who you belonged to and who might be willing to stand beside you. Without it, you were simply a voice in a crowd, a figure whose word carried no established weight. Imagine your own name spoken aloud. First the given name, then the surname that tied you to a lineage. John Atwood, meaning John whose father had held woodland rights, or Agnes Carter, daughter of the family known for weaving. That second name was more than an afterthought. It was a shield, a way of saying that you did not stand alone. When disputes arose, over land, a debt, or an injury, the surname served as a kind of guarantee. It told the court that you came from people with a place in the community, a reputation that could be vouched for. If you were wronged, your surname drew others to your side. Cousins who might offer testimony, neighbors who would swear to your character, a local noble whose interests were connected to your family's prosperity. Imagine, by contrast, the experience of a person without this protection. Perhaps you were born to laborers who had never settled long enough to establish a consistent family name. Or you were an orphan whose parents' identities were lost to time. You might be called only by a first name or by an unflattering description. Henry the Wanderer, or Marjorie No Name. When it came time to speak in court, that absence of lineage became a heavy silence. You might present your complaint in careful words, recount every detail, and still find your story set aside. The steward, scratching notes with his quill, would glance up and ask, "Who stands for you?" And if no surname linked you to a web of obligations and loyalties, no one might answer. This was the rhythm of justice in those centuries. A system built not only on evidence, but on affiliation. Courts did not operate as neutral arbiters in the modern sense. They were places where reputation and relationships carried as much weight as facts. To have a recognized surname was to carry proof that your life mattered to others. It was a quiet assurance that you could be trusted to repay debts, to keep oaths, and to uphold the customs that bound communities together. Consider the power of a noble patron attached to your family's name. Even the suggestion that a lord had an interest in your welfare could tip the balance of a dispute. A letter, a spoken word in your favor, or the presence of a steward known to be friendly to your kin. These small gestures could mean the difference between vindication and ruin. If, on the other hand, you were accused of wrongdoing, a theft, a trespass, or a breach of contract, a surname could still be your best defense. It meant there were people willing to vouch that you had always been honest, or that you had no reason to do harm. In a time before forensic evidence, character was often the strongest argument you could offer. Imagine the quiet dread of standing alone, no surname to call upon. Your word weighed against that of a more established neighbor. The court might proceed with all the forms of justice, questions, oaths, tokens of proof, but without a recognized name, the outcome was rarely in doubt. Even if you were innocent, you were an unknown quantity, and unknowns were treated with caution, if not outright suspicion. Over time, this reliance on surnames shaped the way people presented themselves. Families worked carefully to protect their good name, avoiding entanglements that could stain their standing. Disputes were sometimes settled in private, rather than risk the damage of public accusation. A father might impress on his children the importance of honest dealing, knowing that one careless act could cast a shadow that lasted generations. Yet for those without a traceable family name, life remained precarious. Some took the name of a benefactor or a landlord, adopting it in hopes of borrowing a little of its weight. Others were granted surnames by the authorities themselves, labeled by trade, appearance, or circumstance, names that often carried a reminder of their outsider status. Imagine, finally, the quiet relief that came when your name was called and someone stepped forward to stand beside you. A cousin, a neighbor, an elder of the parish. In that moment, you were no longer alone. Your words were lent gravity by the simple fact that you were part of a recognized lineage. This was the rhythm of their lives, a constant negotiation between identity and belonging, between the private self and the public name. A surname was more than an administrative convenience. It was a promise, sometimes kept, sometimes broken, that you were woven into the fabric of your community, that your story was not just yours but part of something larger. As you allow your thoughts to drift, picture those stone halls and their flickering rushlights, the murmurs of voices waiting for judgment, the calm recitation of names. For each person, that moment held the hope of being seen and believed. Even now, Long after the old manorial courts have disappeared, the quiet human need behind those rituals remains the same. To be recognized, to be trusted, and to have a place where your name and your life carry weight. You could be drafted into war without choice. Imagine yourself in a village at the edge of a wide plain, where the fields stretch toward the horizon in every direction. It is late afternoon. The air is thick with the smell of hay and cooking fires. You hear the muffled sound of hooves approaching, then the sharper clang of iron as riders pass between the houses. A hush falls as neighbors gather at their doors, watching the men dismount. These are the king's men, bailiffs and heralds, clad in leather armor, bearing the symbols of royal authority. They carry a sheaf of papers, a list of names. In many places, those lists were brief, recording only a few established households. But in villages like this one, where families lived and died without ever being written into a ledger, anyone could be summoned. To be conscripted in medieval and early modern times was not simply an inconvenience. It was often a sudden rupture, an order delivered without warning, a command that you would leave behind everything you knew. Whether or not you had ever held a sword, whether you had children or debts or fields ready for harvest, none of it mattered if you had no title to protect you. Imagine the moment when the names are read aloud. The bailiff's voice is flat and practiced. Each name carries the weight of finality. For those who had a family crest or a patron in a city hall, there might be time to protest, to purchase exemption or send a paid substitute. But for the unnamed, those whose ancestors never held land, those who never appeared in the roles of vassals and tenants, there was no appeal. You might be a shepherd's son of 20, with no surname recorded beyond the name of your village. Or perhaps a miller's apprentice, your birth noted in the parish register, but never again in any official account. In the eyes of authority, you were convenient to claim, easy to replace, and difficult to defend. Some conscription orders were read aloud in churchyards after Sunday Mass. Others were posted on the door of the tavern or nailed to a tree in the village square. The wording was often deceptively formal, a polite declaration that any man of fighting age must present himself within days. Refusal carried dire consequences. Fines so large that they might leave a family destitute, or more often, the penalty of death. Picture a young man standing with his cap in hand as the bailiff approaches. There is no outcry, no plea, only the quiet understanding that the question is not whether he will go, but whether he will ever return. The reasons for these levies were varied. A border conflict, a feudal quarrel, a crusade declared by distant powers who never set foot in your valley. To those who carried the weapons, the cause often mattered less than the fact that they were obliged to fight. Conscripted villagers were rarely trained soldiers. A man might be handed a spear with a rough-hewn shaft, a helmet dented by years of use. Sometimes, the most preparation he received was a hurried blessing from the local priest. There was no uniform as we imagine it, just whatever clothing he owned layered under scraps of armor. Imagine the road stretching out beyond the village, a thin procession of men walking away from the only place they had ever known. Behind them, mothers clutched children close, wives hid their tears behind kerchiefs, and fathers looked on with the weary resignation of those who had once been called themselves. For those who survived the march to camp, the reality of war was a grim education. Sleep came on cold ground under rough blankets. Meals were coarse bread, and whatever could be foraged or stolen. Disease often killed more men than any battle. Yet even in that hardship, the conscripts remained bound by the same inescapable truth. They were there because no one of importance had spoken their name in protest. The absence of a surname, an established claim to land or lineage, was more than a technicality. It marked you as unshielded. If you fell in battle, your body might never be returned. If you survived, there was no pension or recognition. You came home with your life, and little else. Imagine a soldier returning months later, thinner, changed. His neighbors gather to see him step from the road into the yard, where weeds have overgrown the doorway. There is relief in his arrival, but also the quiet understanding that he will carry those memories unspoken for the rest of his days. In rare cases, conscripts who distinguished themselves, who showed courage or skill, might be named in a letter sent up the chain of command. But for most, their service remained anonymous. Even the chronicles that recorded campaigns and victories rarely mentioned the rank and file. The phrase common foot soldier was enough to encompass thousands of lives. Over time, the practice of forced levies evolved. Monarchs learned that professional standing armies were more effective than crowds of unwilling peasants. But even into the early modern era, the threat of conscription hovered over villages whenever war loomed. Some communities tried to protect their own by collecting funds to hire substitutes, men who would take the place of a local youth for a price. In others, families hid sons in barns or sent them to distant relatives until the levy passed. These small rebellions were born of desperation, but discovery often brought severe punishment. As you let your mind drift, consider how it felt to live in a world where your life could be claimed by a stranger's list, where survival meant not only enduring hunger and illness, but hoping your name would never be spoken aloud in a village square. Yet even in those moments, when men stood side by side under banners they did not choose, there were flickers of resilience. A shared joke over a campfire, a scrap of bread offered by a comrade, a quiet promise whispered to oneself. If I live, I will come home. So as you settle into stillness, imagine the hush that fell after the heralds left. The roads grown quiet again, the fields waiting to be harvested by those who remained. And in that hush, the knowledge that, for the nameless, survival was always a matter of luck, endurance, and the silent hope that no one would come again with a list. And so history moved forward, one conscripted life at a time, unrecorded in chronicles, but never forgotten by those who waited for their return. Nobles could claim your children as property. Imagine yourself standing in the courtyard of a great manor house. The early morning sun glints off the iron hinges of the gate and the polished boots of the steward who stands watch. Beyond the walls, small cottages cluster along the edge of the fields. The people who live there rise before dawn, their days a steady cycle of planting, harvesting, and tending to animals. But beneath this rhythm of work was a quiet, persistent fear. For families without a surname recognized by charter or law, or without a deed to even the smallest piece of land, there was no shield against the reach of the powerful. In many parts of medieval and early modern Europe, a noble's authority extended far beyond collecting rents. It reached into every corner of a peasant's life, including their children. Picture a mother standing in her doorway, her youngest child on her hip, her older children clustered behind her skirts. She has no parchment to prove her family's standing, no seal to authenticate her right to keep her household intact. When a lord's steward arrives, she has little recourse but to listen. Children, in these circumstances, were more than offspring. They were resources. Future laborers in the fields, extra hands in the kitchens, potential soldiers to be pressed into service. The law, written by and for the landed classes, offered no clear protections for families who owned no land and carried no established surname. Imagine the rhythm of the steward's visits. He might come to collect dues, to check the tally of livestock, to claim a share of the harvest. But sometimes he came to select young people for obligations the household could neither refuse nor postpone. A healthy boy of 12 might be marked for training in the Lord's retinue, ostensibly an honor, though it often meant a life spent in service or war. A girl might be sent to the manor as a servant, her labor part of her family's rent. These customs were shaped by necessity and custom as much as by cruelty. Lords needed labor to keep their estates productive, and under systems of serfdom or villanage, Entire families could be bound to the land. When harvest failed or debt mounted, the children became collateral. If you had no surname, no clear legal identity, the claim was easier to press. You could protest, but there was little hope of recourse. Imagine how this uncertainty shaped the life of a child. Each morning might bring a summons to the manor. Each knock at the door could signal the end of childhood and the beginning of servitude. In some regions, the practice became formalized. Tallies of available boys were kept to plan military levies. Records of girls who could be placed in noble households were updated alongside inventories of grain and livestock. Even when families had long worked the same fields, their rights were precarious. A change of lord, through inheritance, marriage, or conquest, could bring new demands. Some nobles were more lenient, content to collect rents and leave peasant families in peace. Others were more exacting, measuring their power by how completely they could command the lives of those beneath them. In certain places, a family might try to shield their children by sending them to relatives in distant villages or arranging a hurried marriage to confer a semblance of status. But these strategies carried risks. A child sent away could be pursued and retrieved. A hasty marriage might not be recognized if no one of standing bore witness. Over time, the tide began to shift. Laws codifying tenants' rights gradually emerged. The spread of written contracts and parish registers offered a measure of proof that a family belonged to a place, that their children could not be claimed at will. But for generations, such protections were fragile or non-existent. Imagine the dim interior of a cottage at dusk. A family gathered around the hearth. A father mends a harness by lamplight, glancing now and then toward the doorway, as if expecting a knock. The mother hushes the youngest child, pressing her hand over the small, tangled curls. They are together in this moment, but they do not know for how long. The consequences of these customs stretched beyond labor or military service. Sometimes children were claimed as wards of the manor. Raised among the servants, their ties to their own families gradually weakened until they could scarcely remember another life. Occasionally, a talented boy might rise through the ranks of a noble household, becoming a squire or steward. But more often, the path led to anonymous toil, the child's name and story lost to record. Imagine the ledger kept in a steward's hand, rows of names or simply descriptions. The elder son, the younger daughter, the child of no known father. Each line represented a life redirected, an absence felt in the hush that followed a door closing behind a departing child. Today, when we look back, it is easy to feel only the injustice, but for the families who endured, there was also resilience. Parents who lost their children to service found small ways to stay connected, sending gifts when possible, repeating the child's name in evening prayers, keeping a place for them in the stories told around the fire. As you let your thoughts drift across centuries, picture that quiet cottage again. The walls are thin, the wind presses through the cracks, but within, there is still a measure of warmth. A mother and father hold their children close, knowing they cannot guarantee tomorrow, but determined to give them what protection they can. And in the rhythm of their lives, marked by worry, endurance, and the hope that someday things might change, you see the quiet, persistent dignity that no noble claim could ever fully extinguish. You were called by where you slept. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a medieval village in the soft light of early dawn. A chill hangs in the air, and a pale ribbon of smoke rises from a small cottage nearby. Along the rutted lane, a few children begin their morning tasks, gathering kindling, fetching water from the well, leading thin goats out to graze. Among them are children whose names are not inherited or chosen, but borrowed from the place where they sleep. In many corners of medieval and early modern Europe, identity could be as transient as shelter. When children had no family name, or no family at all, they were often known simply by their location. A boy taken in by the miller became Elias of the Mill, A girl who slept on a pallet by the old bridge was called Lena by the bridge. These names were as impermanent as the roofs over their heads, shifting each time they were forced to move. Imagine the small customs that shaped this way of naming. In an age when official records were sparse and literacy was rare, a name had to serve as a map, a way to tell one child from another, to remember who owed labor or care, and to mark where each life began and ended. Parish registers, household accounts, and church tithes were all filled with these simple descriptions. To the scribes who recorded them, they were sufficient. To the children who bore them, they were a quiet reminder of how easily a life could be uprooted. Picture a young boy, no more than 9, standing near the mill race. His hands are chapped from carrying sacks of grain. The mill wheel creaks in its slow, patient turning, the water thick with silt and fallen leaves. To the villagers, he is Elias of the mill. His true surname has faded from memory, tucked away in some distant ledger or lost entirely. He wears the name as both a shield and a burden, proof of belonging, but also of impermanence. For children like Elias, a name could change as quickly as the weather. If the miller could no longer feed another mouth, the boy might be sent to the shepherd's hut or the bakehouse. Each move meant a new title, a fresh description to be repeated at the church door or before the reeve who kept the manorial rolls. Over time, the names blended together, creating a blurred record of a life defined more by survival than continuity. Imagine the rhythm of such a childhood. A day spent mending nets by the river. A night curled up in a loft above the cowshed. A week under the thatch of the carpenter's workshop. Each place had its own smells and sounds. The sweet musk of straw, the damp chill of a stone floor, the steady hum of bees in a garden behind the house. And each place bestowed its own brief identity. For some children, this cycle began with the loss of parents, taken by illness, famine, or war. Others were abandoned to the care of a parish or monastery, where charity came with the expectation of labor. Whether they were called Peter at the gate, Alice by the wall, or John of the granary, their names reminded everyone, including themselves, that they were children without a fixed place in the world. Yet even in these fragile identities, there were moments of kindness and familiarity. Picture an evening when the carpenter's wife, seeing the boy shivering in the doorway, placed a hand on his shoulder and called him not by his borrowed title, but simply child. Or a day when an older girl, herself once known as Joan by the well, offered a scrap of bread and the comfort of shared understanding. Over time, some of these children grew into adults who carried their place names into the records of marriage, taxes, and burial. A man known in his youth as Thomas at the forge might still be called so long after he had moved on. Others eventually claimed or inherited a proper surname, often derived from the very place name they were first given. In this way, a mark of impermanence could become a permanent label passed down to sons and daughters. Imagine the quiet ache that could accompany such a transformation. A name that began as a temporary description, born of necessity, gradually hardened into an identity that could never be quite shed. It was a subtle reminder that some lives began without the safety of a family, shaped instead by the landscapes that offered shelter. Yet within this system, there were always small acts of resilience. Children learned to memorize the contours of each place they stayed, to recognize the kindness of a stranger's table, and to carry a sense of self that went beyond the titles others used. In the soft hours before dawn, when the village still slept, they might whisper their birth names to themselves, names almost forgotten, but never fully extinguished. And so, when you think of the past, allow yourself to see these quieter stories. The child called Lena by the bridge, tracing her finger along the stones as she waited for morning bread. The boy known as Elias of the mill, watching the wheel turn day after day, his thoughts drifting beyond the narrow lane that named him. These were lives shaped by necessity, by loss, and by the quiet endurance of children who learned to find meaning wherever they could. In this way, history reminds us that identity is often a fragile thing. A name can be a gift, a burden, or a borrowed garment worn only until the next shelter beckons. But even in the most uncertain of circumstances, there is a quiet dignity in claiming one's story and carrying it forward, no matter how often it changes. You were a target for tax collectors. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a muddy village green, your feet sinking slightly into the churned earth as you wait in the lengthening shadow of the tax collector's horse. Around you, the other villagers gather in uneasy clusters, each clutching whatever scrap of record or token of exemption they can muster. But for you, there is nothing to hold. No parchment bearing your family's surname, no official tally of holdings to argue your case. For centuries, having no formal surname meant more than a lack of prestige. It meant you were a target, an easy mark for tax collectors who travel from estate to estate, town to town, carrying the authority of the Lord or the crown. In a world where identity was pinned to record books, to charters and lists, those who could not point to a clear name or a place in the hierarchy found themselves with no defense. The rhythm of their lives was shaped by this vulnerability. Tax collectors arrived on predictable schedules. After the harvest, before midsummer, sometimes at the whim of a lord's sudden need. Each visit was announced by the same sounds: the clatter of hooves, the jangle of harness, the crisp voice calling the community to assemble. Those with surnames and documented holdings could at least negotiate, argue over the measure of grain owed, the number of beasts kept, the fees already paid. But without such proof, you were simply the one standing at the back of the crowd, hoping that your poverty might render you invisible. It rarely did. Imagine the small dramas that played out in the hours of accounting. A neighbor produced a brittle scrap of parchment. Thomas, son of Richard of Eastfield, it read, and the collector, after some grumbling, might adjust the tally. Another held out a tally stick notched with last year's payments, evidence of taxes already discharged. But you, with no surname to anchor your place in the records, were simply William the Thatcher or Alice the Spinster, an entry in no ledger, a subject with no standing to protest. In the eyes of the officials, this lack of documentation did not mean you were exempt. Quite the opposite. It meant you could not easily claim any privileges or protections. No formal record meant no proof of partial exemption, no recognition of hardship, no recourse if the tax collector decided to levy more than your share. The rhythm of collection was brisk and impersonal. A clerk stood to one side, marking each name and amount in a book. Those without names were often listed by occupation alone. 2 laborers, 1 serving woman, widow unnamed. When payments fell short, goods were seized, a blanket, a pot, a clutch of hens. In extreme cases, a portion of the coming harvest was claimed before it was even planted. Imagine the quiet desperation that followed. A mother wondering how she would feed her children without the hens taken in lieu of coin. A father reckoning how many days of labor it would take to ransom back the family's only mule. The absence of a surname meant there was no appeal, no higher record to which you might point. What the collector demanded, you gave, or you lost even more. Among the wealthier households, formal names and records offered a layer of protection. A freeholder could cite the terms of his lease, reminding the collector that he owed no more than a fixed rent. A minor noblewoman might present a letter of privilege confirming her family's tax exemption. Even modest yeomen sometimes held documents granting partial relief during famine or illness. But the landless, the unrecorded, those whose identities were spoken but never written, these were the easiest to burden. Collectors knew it. Lords knew it. Neighbors knew it too. And so, every season, the same pattern unfolded. The unprotected paid more, or lost more, because there was no barrier between them and the demands of authority. The rhythm of taxation was not always harsh in word. but it was relentless in effect. You might be told, gently enough, that payment must be made in good conscience, that all must do their share. Yet when the sums were tallied, the burden weighed heaviest on those least able to carry it. Imagine the hush of a household after the collector departed. A father sat by the hearth, turning over in his palm the last few coins not demanded that day. A mother counted the loaves that must now last until the next harvest. In that quiet, children learned early what it meant to be known only by a first name. How easily you could be singled out and made to pay more than your share. Even among those who dreamed of escaping their station, the lack of a surname closed doors. To lease land, to sign a contract, to seek the patronage of a more powerful household, all required a name that could be recorded and verified. Without it, your standing was too uncertain. A tax collector could return in a month and claim you had never paid at all, and you would have nothing but your own word to offer in defense. The rhythm of their lives was a negotiation between visibility and erasure. If you were too obscure, you could be claimed by any official in search of revenue. If you protested too loudly, you risked punishment or eviction. So most did what generations had done before: paid quietly, replaced what they could, and hoped the next season might be kinder. Among the clergy, there were sometimes efforts to shield the poorest from the harshest demands. A village priest might plead on behalf of a widow or orphan. Monasteries sometimes offered alms to repay debts. But such charity was never enough to offset the imbalance. For every reprieve, dozens more went unrecorded and unaided. Imagine the final reckoning at the close of the year, when all dues were tallied and the record sealed. Those with surnames saw their payments entered neatly in the ledger, a measure of security for the next season. Those without remained at the margins, names spoken aloud but never truly inscribed. Identities too fragile to resist the pressure of tax and tribute. It is a simple truth, repeated across centuries. The absence of a surname was not only a mark of low standing, but an invitation to be taxed beyond endurance. The rhythm of their lives was shaped by this quiet, grinding injustice, a testament to how power found its easiest targets among those who could least defend themselves. Even now, in the hush of abandoned villages, you can almost imagine the soft, weary voices of those who handed over their last coins, hoping against hope that they would not be remembered when the collectors came again. The rhythm endures, a reminder that in the long story of human survival, the cost of being unnamed was measured in more than coin. You couldn't legally marry without clerical permission. Imagine yourself in a small stone church, its cool interior thick with the scent of old incense and damp wood. Sunlight slants through narrow windows, illuminating a simple altar where countless couples have stood before you. In this quiet place, marriage is not only a bond of affection or practicality. It is a formal act that requires the approval of church and community alike. For centuries, to marry without permission was to risk having your union declared invalid, your children marked as illegitimate, and your household denied protection. In many parts of medieval and early modern Europe, marriage could not simply be declared by two people alone. It was a public contract, witnessed and recorded by clerics who kept the registers. These priests or parish officials were charged with upholding not only the moral codes of their faith, but also the legal frameworks that govern property, inheritance, and kinship. If you lacked a surname, the path to approval could be tangled and uncertain. Consider the role a surname played in this process. It told the priest who you were and where you belonged. William Cooper meant William, son of a Cooper, linked to a trade and a lineage. Alice of Windmere was Alice from the hamlet by the marsh. A surname signified reputation, proof that someone would vouch for your character, that you came from known stock. If you could not provide such proof, if your name was inconsistent, or you were known only by a given name, the priest was obliged to question your standing. Could you be trusted to keep the vows you were about to make? Were you already promised to another? Were you attempting to obscure your origins to gain property or advantage? Imagine standing with your intended, hands clasped, listening as the priest read out the banns of marriage. These public announcements, repeated over 3 Sundays, were designed to allow anyone with an objection to come forward. But before the bans could even begin, you needed clerical consent. Without it, no blessing would be offered, no line would be inked into the parish register, no legal recognition would follow. For people without surnames, orphans, itinerant laborers, those born outside wedlock, the process could be humbling. A priest might require written testimony from a landowner or noble confirming your identity. In some cases, you had to travel to a higher ecclesiastical authority, perhaps a bishop or archdeacon, to secure a special dispensation. These journeys could take weeks and cost more than many families could spare. Imagine the quiet frustration of waiting in a cold anteroom, your petition folded in your hands, as clerics discussed your worthiness behind a door. Even if your intentions were honorable, suspicion hung over every request. Some clergy feared they would be blamed if an unsuitable marriage led to scandal. Others simply viewed the nameless with a measure of disdain, assuming that if your lineage could not be traced, your moral character was equally uncertain. Occasionally, the noble families who held authority over local lands also claimed a voice in approving marriages. This was especially true for tenants living on estates. A landlord might refuse consent if he believed a marriage would interfere with obligations, reduce the workforce, or complicate inheritance of leased property. In this way, the absence of a recognized surname became not just a bureaucratic inconvenience, but a barrier to forming a family at all. For some, the solution was a quiet, unlicensed union, what we would now call common law marriage. These couples lived as husband and wife without the blessing of church or court. They raised children, shared property, and built lives together in the margins of the law. But such arrangements carried risks. Without clerical recognition, their union could be challenged. If the husband died, the widow might have no claim to his land or goods. Their children could be denied inheritance or face lifelong stigma. Over time, reforming clergy and civic leaders sought to impose more consistent rules. Parish registers became more detailed. Bans were more rigorously enforced. Surnames were standardized. But even as record-keeping improved, those without clear identities remained vulnerable. A simple omission, a lost baptismal record, a name spelled differently in 2 documents, could unravel a marriage before it began. Yet despite these obstacles, love and necessity often found a way. Neighbors served as witnesses, stepping forward to testify that the couple had lived honestly. Midwives and elders recounted the story of a person's birth, piecing together a lineage that might satisfy a skeptical priest. Some communities quietly overlooked formal requirements, understanding that survival sometimes mattered more than paperwork. Imagine, finally, the quiet relief of standing before the altar, the priest's hand raised in blessing, the last uncertainty resolved. Even the simplest ceremony, 2 rings, a shared cup, a line in the ledger, became a profound declaration that you belonged to one another and to the community. This was the rhythm of their lives, a delicate balance between love and legitimacy, between private commitment and public recognition. A surname, in that world, was more than an identifier. It was a key that unlocked the doors of law, faith, and society itself. As you let your thoughts drift, you can picture those dim churches with their cool flagstones, the hush that fell when the vows were spoken, the soft scratch of the scribe recording the names. For each couple, this moment marked the start of something fragile yet resilient, a bond that could endure even when the world insisted it did not officially exist. And in those quiet spaces where names were uncertain and permissions hard-won, you can glimpse the quiet determination that has always carried ordinary people through history's most exacting trials. You were denied burial with your family. Imagine yourself in the cool hush of a medieval churchyard at dawn. The grass glistens with dew. The only sound is the quiet tapping of a sexton's spade against a stone marker as he clears last year's leaves. Each grave is marked with a name carved in soft limestone, the letters weathered by generations of wind and rain. These names anchor the dead to their families, their lineage, and their place in the world. Yet beyond the churchyard wall, there is another field, one that most villagers seldom spoke of. Here, there are no carved stones, no crosses, no tidy rows. Just rough mounds in the earth, grown over with nettles and brambles. This is the burial ground for those who died without the protection of a family name. In medieval society, belonging was measured in many ways. By land, by kinship, by the records kept in parish ledgers. A name was more than a word. It was proof that you were someone's child, that you descended from a line recognized by the community. Without that, you existed in a kind of social limbo, accepted in life only as much as necessity required, and in death, relegated to the margins. Imagine the moment when a villager died, and the priest asked the simple question, "What name shall I record?" For those with established families, the answer was straightforward. The name linked the departed to a known plot, often a small rectangle of earth shared by generations. A place where loved ones could return to grieve. But for others, bastards, foundlings, wanderers, there was no such anchor. If you could not name a father, if you carried no family title, the church might deny you a place among the blessed dead. In many parishes, burial inside the churchyard walls was reserved for those who had contributed tithes, who had been baptized and recorded, whose lineage could be traced. Even the poorest laborer might claim a corner if he belonged to a known family. But without that claim, the final rest took place outside the consecrated ground, on the edge of pasture land or near the crossroads where travelers passed. Imagine the quiet heartbreak of such a burial, a body wrapped in a plain winding sheet, carried at dusk to avoid the gaze of neighbors. No tolling bell, no solemn procession, a shallow grave dug by the sexton alone. Sometimes, a single stone was placed over the earth to discourage animals, but often there was nothing at all to mark the spot. These burials were not always the result of cruelty. They reflected a world in which spiritual belonging and social legitimacy were tightly intertwined. A name meant prayers would be said, masses offered, and a place kept among ancestors. Without that name, even death did not grant full inclusion. In some regions, those buried outside the churchyard were believed to linger uneasily. Their souls were thought to wander, restless for lack of proper rites. Families who could afford it sometimes paid later to have remains exhumed and reinterred within the walls. Once proof of legitimacy or a charitable donation was offered. But for most, the exile was permanent. Picture a mother standing by such a grave as twilight deepens. She murmurs a prayer, though no priest is present to bless the words. She knows that in years to come, she may not be able to find this place again. The earth will smooth itself over, and the memory of where her child or her husband lay will fade. Even in death, the absence of a surname cast a long shadow. It meant no one would carve a cross or record your passing beyond a terse note in the margins of a register. Buried beyond the wall. In times of plague, the practice became even starker. When death came too quickly for formal rituals, unnamed bodies were carried out in carts and laid together in pits beyond the churchyard boundary. These mass graves bore no individual markers, and the loss they represented was too vast for any ledger to hold. Yet despite these customs, there were always moments of quiet defiance. Some families who could not secure a burial plot crept back by night to leave tokens. A scrap of cloth, a small wooden cross, a sprig of herbs. These humble gestures were their way of insisting that a loved one, however unrecorded, still mattered. Over time, laws and customs began to soften. In some areas, charitable fraternities emerged, offering burial and prayers for the poor and unclaimed. But in many villages, the tradition of denying burial among the community persisted well into the modern era. It is easy now to look back and wonder how such divisions could have felt natural. But to medieval people, identity and salvation were bound up with lineage, and the need to protect the sanctity of consecrated ground seemed as unquestionable as the rising of the sun. Imagine, as you drift deeper into thought, the churchyard at dusk. The last light catches the carvings on weathered stones, each name linked to a story, a family, a place. Just beyond the wall, the grass grows taller and wilder. In that space without markers, countless lives came to rest in anonymity. Yet even there, love persisted. Grief did not respect the boundaries of consecration. Mothers still returned to weep. Sweethearts still carried flowers. Children still remembered the patch of earth where someone dear had vanished into the ground. In this way, history was shaped not only by the powerful whose names were etched in stone, but also by the countless ordinary souls who passed without record, whose quiet endurance and unremarked sorrows made up the true fabric of their world. So as you let your mind drift now, picture that wild edge of the churchyard, where nettles swayed and the air was filled with the hush of twilight. In that quiet place, the truth of belonging was simpler than any record could show. To be loved was to be remembered, even if no one ever carved your name in stone. You were often blamed first during disputes. Imagine yourself standing in a small village square just after dawn. The air is cool and damp, carrying the earthy scent of wet thatch and turned soil. A handful of neighbors gather near the church steps, voices low and uneasy. Someone's pig has gone missing in the night. A sack of barley has vanished from a granary. In this world, where every harvest and every animal was precious, such losses felt like a small calamity. When misfortune struck, when a theft or a fight disturbed the fragile peace, the question was never if there would be blame, but whom it would fall upon. And more often than not, it settled first on those without names anyone cared to remember. The ones called strangers, wanderers, or simply nameless ones. In many communities, identity was everything. A person's standing was defined by ties, to land, to a household, to the familiar names recorded in parish rolls and guild ledgers. If you could not point to your father's holdings or your grandfather's service to a local lord, you were regarded with quiet suspicion. Imagine a man who had drifted from another village, looking for seasonal work. He might be skilled, willing to labor from dawn until dusk, but without a recognized family name, he remained an outsider. If a quarrel broke out in a tavern, or a tool disappeared from a cart, the gaze of the constable would turn to him first. The rhythm of accusation often followed the same course. Neighbors would gather, each telling their version of events. Familiar names were given the benefit of the doubt. Old grievances resurfaced, sometimes so faint no one could recall exactly when they began. And the man without connections had no advocate to speak for his character. The process was seldom formal in the beginning. It started as murmured speculation. A word dropped over a fence, a nod exchanged between two elders. By the time the village reeve arrived, the suspicion had grown roots. It did not take proof to condemn someone who could not anchor themselves in the memory of the place. Imagine the quiet dread of living under this scrutiny. Every misstep, every accidental slight or misunderstood word, might be the one that tipped the balance. Even a child whose parents had no property or surname might feel this burden. In schoolrooms and fields, they were the first to be questioned when something was broken or missing. These customs were not written in law books so much as embedded in the fabric of communal life. In villages where most people were born and died within the same few miles, familiarity became its own kind of protection. To be known was to be, in some small way, forgiven. To be unknown was to be suspect. When disputes grew serious, local authorities would sometimes convene an inquest, a gathering of respected men to weigh testimony. But in these hearings, the evidence often mattered less than the question of reputation. If no one could vouch for your honesty, if no neighbor would stand beside you, your innocence was fragile indeed. Imagine the interior of a timbered hall, smoky from the hearth, where villagers stand in a semicircle. A young woman steps forward to swear she saw you near the granary. You open your mouth to protest, but the reeve's eyes flick to your tattered cloak and the calloused hands that mark you as a wanderer. He does not need to say what everyone is thinking. Not every accusation ended in punishment. Sometimes the blame simply lingered like a stain. You might be allowed to stay in the village, but work would dry up. Friendly greetings would grow curt. Children would be called indoors when you passed. Over time, these small rejections could drive a person to move on, seeking another place where no one yet knew their name. In rare cases, the community would discover the real culprit. A neighbor's son, perhaps, or a servant hoping to leave quietly. When that happened, there might be a moment of awkward apology, but the memory of suspicion clung to the once accused. The next time something went missing, the same names would rise to everyone's lips. Over generations, as written records became more common and parish registers more complete, it grew harder to be truly nameless. Yet even in later centuries, people who travel for work, migrant laborers, tinkers, peddlers, remained easy targets for blame. To be rootless was to be perpetually vulnerable. Imagine the quiet endurance of those who bore this burden. The father who labored twice as hard to earn a scrap of respect. The mother who taught her children to keep their heads down and their voices soft. The young men who learned to leave a village before suspicion settled in for good. And yet, there was resilience in these lives too. Over time, some managed to build small reputations of their own. A craftsman whose skill could not be denied. A midwife whose steady hands saved lives. A laborer whose honesty earned grudging respect. Bit by bit, trust grew, though never as easily as it came to those born under familiar roofs. As you drift toward rest, picture the village square once more. The dawn mist begins to lift, revealing the outlines of cottages and fields. Somewhere, a child calls to a dog, a pot is set on a hearth, a bell tolls the hour. In this world, names carried weight heavier than any burden. To be nameless was to walk always in the shadow of suspicion. And yet, amid that shadow, countless men and women carried on. Working, hoping, and quietly insisting on their humanity, even when no one was willing to speak for them. You had no ancestral identity to pass on. Imagine yourself in a modest parish church at the edge of a medieval village. The morning light glows through narrow windows, falling across rows of wooden benches worn smooth by generations. Near the altar, a priest leafs through the parish register. A thick volume inked with names and dates, each line linking a child to a father, a mother, a place of origin. For some, these records are a testament to lineage stretching back centuries. But for others, there is only a blank space where a family name should be, a silence in the line of heritage that no ink can fill. In the world of medieval and early modern Europe, identity was inseparable from ancestry. A surname was not simply a label, but a claim. Proof that you belonged to a lineage, a village, a house. It offered a child the dignity of place, the quiet confidence of knowing that the land they worked and the tools they used had been passed down through generations. But for those who began life without parents, abandoned, orphaned, or unacknowledged, no such inheritance existed. Picture a young girl of 7 or 8, standing near the back of the church as the priest recites the names of parishioners whose ancestors built the chapel walls. She listens, her hands folded neatly, to the roll call of families. Names carried in pride, names that mark property lines, trade privileges, and burial plots. When her turn comes, the priest simply calls her Margaret. without any surname, any lineage, any claim. This absence was more than an administrative gap. It quietly shaped the way such children moved through life. Without an ancestral name, they could not trace their roots to a particular house or clan. There were no stories to tell of great-grandparents who fought in old battles or tilled the same fields. No inherited rights to graze sheep on the commons or draw water from a particular well. Imagine the small indignities that followed. A child without a surname might be referred to only by a place. Joan at the bridge, or an occupation, Thomas the baker. These makeshift names served their purpose, but they also reinforced a quiet message. You have no history to stand on. You are here, but you came from nowhere we remember. At marriage, the absence became painfully visible again. Bans were read aloud, and witnesses were called to confirm identity. For others, the names of fathers and grandfathers were recited in a gentle litany. But for an orphan, the priest would simply state that no parentage could be recorded. In that moment, a life already marked by hardship was further set apart. Picture the rhythm of such a childhood. Days spent tending geese or sweeping hearths. Evenings sitting by the fire in a household not truly one's own. In the quiet hours before sleep, a child might turn over scraps of memory, a mother's lullaby, the shape of a father's hands, and wonder whether those details were enough to count as history. The lack of ancestral identity had practical consequences as well. In a time when land and status were inherited through bloodlines, orphans without surnames struggled to claim even the smallest parcel. They were rarely accepted into guilds, since membership often required proof of parentage and legitimacy. In some places, they were denied the right to bear arms or to represent themselves fully in court. Even burial held its distinctions. In the parish yard, plots were often grouped by family. A surname carved in stone marked the resting place, a visible sign of continuity. For the nameless, graves were simpler, sometimes recorded only by a brief note in the register, sometimes unmarked altogether. Yet even in these quiet exclusions, children learned to weave their own identities. Imagine a boy known only as Peter of the Mill, who spent years carrying sacks of grain and listening to the mill wheel creak and turn. In time, he came to think of the mill as part of himself. Its rhythms shaped his days, and the men who labored beside him became something like kin. In this way, a child without ancestry created belonging out of daily repetition. Over generations, some of these makeshift identities hardened into surnames of their own. The son of Thomas the Carter might become Thomas Carter in the parish book, his children known by that name long after the memory of how it began had faded. This slow transformation was not always enough to erase the feeling of rootlessness, but it allowed a measure of permanence to take hold. Imagine the quiet pride of such a person, decades later, when called upon to state a name in front of neighbors. For the first time, there is something more solid to say, something more than a borrowed description or a fleeting location. When you picture life in this era, it helps to remember that heritage was both a gift and a barrier. For many, it offered protection, a soft shield of familiarity that opened doors and eased suspicion. But for those without it, the path forward was narrower, the burden heavier. Yet there was also a quiet resilience in the way these children grew into their circumstances. In the absence of ancestral stories, they learned to shape their own. In the absence of inherited rights, they created worth from labor and persistence. And so, when you think of the past, let yourself linger on these lives. The children who stood at the back of the church, listening to names they would never claim. The young men and women who built identity from what was at hand. An occupation, a place, a community willing to make room for them. These are the stories that remind us that history is not only the record of the powerful and the privileged. It is also the record of those who began with nothing, who carried no surname, no legacy, no shield of ancestry, and yet found ways to belong, to endure, and to leave behind a name of their own. You couldn't take holy orders without a known name. Imagine yourself in the long, narrow nave of an old stone church. The early light sifts through tall windows, catching on motes of dust that drift silently in the air. At the front, a priest reads from a great book propped upon the altar, his voice low and measured. Around you, the congregation stands in reverent silence. But if you looked closely, you might notice that some faces in the crowd belong only partly to this world. Men and women who dream of leaving behind the burdens of ordinary life to enter the church itself. For centuries, the church offered one of the few paths out of poverty, conflict, and uncertainty. To take holy orders was to step beyond the ordinary demands of feudal society, to become part of an institution that promised stability and purpose. Yet this door was not open to everyone. Those without a known name, a formal lineage that could be traced, a family that could vouch for their identity, found the way barred. The rhythm of their lives was shaped by this exclusion. In monasteries and priories across Europe, the rule was clear. A novice must be known. He must be presented by a sponsor who could attest to his character, his birth, and his freedom from obligation or crime. A woman seeking to enter a convent faced the same scrutiny. It was not enough to be pious or willing to serve. You needed to belong to someone first, to be accounted for before you could renounce the world. Imagine approaching the gates of an abbey in early spring. The earth still hard with frost. Your hands chapped from a journey that has lasted days. You kneel before the porter, explaining that you wish to dedicate your life to God. But when he asks your name, you can offer only a given name. No family to stand behind you, no parish record to confirm who you are. The porter shakes his head with quiet regret. Without proof of origin, you cannot be received. This insistence on identity was not merely custom. It was a safeguard against deception. The church feared the arrival of fugitives, serfs fleeing their lords, criminals evading justice, debtors hoping to disappear behind cloister walls. A man without a known name could be anyone, could be carrying obligations or guilt that would compromise the community's peace. The rhythm of admission into holy orders was meticulous. A would-be monk or priest was questioned about his past, his family, his ties to any lord or land. Witnesses were called to verify his claims. Written records, baptismal certificates, letters of recommendation were examined. If all was in order, he might be granted the postulant's habit and begin his novitiate. But without these proofs, the doors remained closed. Imagine the quiet desperation of those turned away. A young man, weary of hard service in the fields, who had dreamed of a life of study and prayer. A woman, burdened by an arranged marriage she hoped to escape through the convent's protection. For them, the lack of a verified name was more than an inconvenience. It was a sentence to remain in the world they had hoped to leave behind. Even among those of modest means, some families kept careful records precisely so that a child might one day enter the church. A father might save a single scrap of parchment proving a baptism, or secure a priest's written endorsement. These tokens were treasured across generations, their value measured not in coin, but in the fragile opportunity they preserved. Imagine the small bundle of documents wrapped in oiled cloth against the damp. A mother passed it to her son as he set out for the abbey, her hands trembling not with sadness, but with hope. Within those folded pages lay his chance to be received as more than a nameless wanderer. Among wealthier households, the process was simpler. A noble family could offer generous gifts to the monastery, a parcel of land, a share of annual tithes, along with letters affirming the novice's birth and standing. In these cases, admission was rarely in doubt. But for those without name or means, no offering could substitute for a verified identity. The rhythm of these decisions left lasting marks on communities. A village might watch with quiet pride as a neighbor's son was accepted into holy orders. His new life was a credit to the family and a connection to the broader world of the church. Conversely, a failed petition, especially one denied for lack of a name, could linger as an unspoken sadness. Imagine the evening after a rejection. The would-be novice sits beside a dying fire, turning over in his mind the words he could not say, the names he could not claim. In that hush, he understands that his desire to serve God will never outweigh the need for proof. This requirement was more than a practical concern. It was also a reflection of the church's understanding of order. Just as God was believed to know each soul by name, so too did the earthly institution insist on names to distinguish one life from another. To be unnamed was, in a way, to be suspect, to stand outside the ranks of those whose existence could be trusted. Even when a monastery did admit a person of uncertain origins, the path was limited. He might be accepted only as a lay brother, performing manual labor without the possibility of ordination. A woman might be allowed to serve in the convent's kitchen or garden, but never take vows as a nun. Their devotion could be evident, but without a name, their calling was never fully recognized. Imagine the small acts of consolation extended to such individuals. A kindly prior who offered quiet encouragement. A nun who shared her own meager story of acceptance. These kindnesses eased the burden, but could not erase the reality that in the church's eyes, to be nameless was to remain incomplete. It is a simple truth, repeated across centuries. The absence of a known name was a barrier as solid as any wall. The rhythm of their lives was shaped by this boundary. A line drawn not by faith or devotion, but by the cold demands of record and reputation. Even now, in the hush of old abbey ruins, you can almost hear the echoes of voices that never found their place within those walls. The rhythm endures, a reminder that in a world ruled by order and memory, the price of being unknown was often the chance to belong. Your lineage was considered illegitimate. Imagine yourself standing on the worn steps of a village church, the heavy wooden door just ajar so you can hear the low voices within. A scribe is reading from the parish register, a ledger filled with neat columns of names. Who was born, who was wed, who had died. In this book, a surname was more than a word. It was a declaration of legitimacy, a visible sign that your family belonged. For centuries, a name was a quiet proof that your parents' union had been properly recognized by church and community alike. It showed that your birth followed custom and law. Without a surname to anchor your identity, people began to wonder, were your parents truly married? Had they pledged their vows before a priest? Or had you arrived without the blessing that turned a union into something the world agreed to honor? Consider how quickly such suspicions could take root. If your mother carried you into the church to be baptized and could not provide a surname, the priest might hesitate before dipping his hand into the font. Some clergy kept separate notations in their registers for children born out of wedlock, a quiet mark that followed a person for life. In noble households, the stakes were even higher. A title, a tract of land, the right to bear a coat of arms. These privileges all rested on clear descent. A single disputed lineage could undo years of careful alliances and inheritance. When a noble child's legitimacy was questioned, families might produce letters, witness testimony, or even relics of the wedding day to prove that the parents had married properly. Imagine the quiet tension in a great hall, a line of anxious retainers and scribes unrolling old parchments before the Lord. In those moments, the absence of a surname could feel like an accusation that somewhere someone had failed to follow the rules. But even in peasant communities, where landholdings were small and wealth was modest, names carried weight. A recognized surname said that you belonged to a lineage with a reputation to uphold. It meant that neighbors were more likely to trust you with borrowed tools or shared harvests. It meant that if you stood in court to swear an oath, your word was less likely to be questioned. Imagine, by contrast, the experience of a child known only as Matthew, son of no one, or Ellen, whose mother was unwed. Even if the family loved and cared for you without reservation, the community's memory was long. A single omission from the parish book could linger in conversations for decades. Sometimes, these doubts hardened into formal barriers. In some towns, children without a recognized surname could be denied apprenticeships or turned away from guild membership. In rural parishes, they might be refused a plot in the main graveyard, buried instead at the margins of consecrated ground. Such distinctions were not always enforced with cruelty, but they shaped the quiet expectations that governed daily life. Imagine the rhythm of a childhood spent listening to these unspoken judgments. Perhaps you were reminded gently by a neighbor, "Your mother did her best," or perhaps the words were sharper, "No good will come of that line. Even if you worked hard, married well, and raised children of your own." The question of your beginning never entirely disappeared. To protect their children from this shadow, some parents tried to secure a surname after the fact. A midwife might be persuaded to vouch for a marriage she had witnessed. A sympathetic priest might amend the register or quietly note the father's name. In other cases, families adopted a new surname altogether, sometimes borrowing it from a nearby village or a respected elder. Over time, these adjustments helped to soften the harshness of official records. Yet even these remedies could not fully erase the quiet stain of uncertainty. In a world that valued clear, traceable lineage, a person whose name did not connect them to an acknowledged union remained, in the eyes of many, slightly apart. Imagine the moment when you stood before the priest to marry, your intended's hand warm in yours. As the scribe prepared to record your vows, he might pause, pen hovering, and ask, "By what name shall your children be known?" That question, so simple in tone, carried centuries of custom and judgment behind it. This was the rhythm of their lives, a constant effort to prove that you came from a recognized union, that you belonged to a web of kinship as old as the fields you worked and the churches where you worshipped. A surname was not merely an identifier. It was a quiet promise that you were entitled to stand among your neighbors without fear of whispered questions. Over time, as civil registries expanded and laws grew more standardized, the old divisions slowly began to ease. But for countless generations, legitimacy and lineage were measured in the same way, by a name written in the careful hand of a clerk or scribe, preserved in a ledger that might outlast every memory. As you let your thoughts drift, you can picture those small parish rooms, the hush that fell when the registers were opened, and the soft rustle of parchment that could decide so much about a person's life. Their stories remind us how something as simple as a name could shape a destiny, and how quietly powerful it felt to be able to say, with certainty, where you belonged. Imagine yourself in the hush of a medieval scriptorium, where the only sounds are the slow scratch of quills and the rustle of parchment. A clerk dips his pen into ink and carefully inscribes a new entry in the parish register. The name he writes is not one that offers pride or protection. It is a label, as permanent as any seal, bastard if followed by a father's name who may never acknowledge the child. In the world of the Middle Ages and early modern Europe, legitimacy shaped a person's fate more completely than almost any other circumstance. To be born within wedlock meant the promise of inheritance, a clear place in the family, and a name that anchored you to the social order. But to be born outside it meant a life begun under a shadow you could never fully escape. Illegitimate children were often denied surnames. Instead, they were given designations that marked their origins like a brand. Fitz, meaning son of, was common in Norman England. Fitzroy, the king's son, Fitzrichard, Fitzgilbert. These names announced both connection and exclusion, a recognition of paternity, but also a reminder that the child had no lawful claim to property or title. For others, the label was starker still, simply bastard of, followed by a father's given name, or worse, no father at all. In small villages, everyone knew the story behind such a name. It clung to the child's identity, repeated in every record, every transaction, every whispered conversation. Imagine a young boy of 6 or 7 standing at the back of the church, listening as the clerk reads aloud the list of those who owe tithes or are entitled to a share of the common lands. He waits to hear his name, but when it comes, it is spoken differently, slower, a little softer, as though even the clerk feels the weight of it. The other children glance back, curious or pitying. This was how stigma began. Quietly, unremarkably, but enduring all the same. The consequences of such a label were practical as well as social. An illegitimate child could rarely inherit land, unless a father went to extraordinary lengths to petition for their rights. Even then, there was always the risk that distant relatives would challenge the claim, citing the child's birth as evidence of unworthiness. Some were luckier. If a father was noble or wealthy, he might acknowledge the child openly, providing them with a place in the household, education, or a modest inheritance. Yet even in such circumstances, the mark of bastardy remained, a polite fiction that this person was less than a legitimate heir. In many places, church doctrine complicated matters further. While the sacrament of baptism was granted freely, the record often included the circumstances of birth in language impossible to disguise. The register might read simply illegitimate, or record the mother's name, and note that the father was unknown. Even in death, these distinctions endured. Burial near one's family was not always granted, especially if the child was never formally recognized. Picture a young woman, no older than 15, bringing her newborn to be christened. Her face is pale with exhaustion, her hands trembling as she hands the baby to the priest. She knows the name will be entered with a label that can never be erased. She knows the child will carry this mark through every season of life. Still, she stands quietly, hoping that at least baptism will offer some measure of grace. In some regions, the language was softened by custom. A child might be called natural son or natural daughter, a phrase that sounded gentler but carried the same legal and social limitations. The child could serve in the household, marry respectably within their station, and even rise in the ranks of military or clergy, but the distinction never fully disappeared. Over time, a few bastards found ways to turn this stigma into an advantage. Some became soldiers, earning reputations for fierce loyalty unburdened by expectations of inheritance. Others became clerks, merchants, or craftsmen, carving out livelihoods that depended less on lineage and more on skill. Yet even these successes did not fully erase the unspoken understanding that they were different. Imagine the moment when a young man signs his name to a contract or a petition. His hand is steady, but in the curve of each letter, there is the knowledge that others will look and see the label first. Fitz or bastard of. The reminder that birth, not merit, had set the terms of his life. In times of upheaval, war, plague, famine, the distinctions occasionally blurred. When communities were desperate for labor or soldiers, they turned a more forgiving eye to questions of legitimacy. But as soon as peace returned, so did the old hierarchies. It is tempting now to look back and wonder why such labels mattered so much, why an accident of birth could shape a destiny so profoundly. But in a world where lineage determined rights, protection, and belonging, legitimacy was a foundation that held the social order in place. To be without it was to stand always at the margins, never fully accepted, never fully safe. As you let your thoughts drift, picture the quiet resilience of those who bore this mark. The child who learned to read so he could sign his name with confidence. The young woman who worked twice as hard to earn respect. The old man who, in his last days, still remembered the first time he heard the word bastard whispered behind his back. And yet, in these lives, there was also a quiet defiance. the knowledge that worth could be proven in other ways. By labor, by loyalty, by small acts of kindness that outlasted the judgments of scribes and priests. So as you settle into stillness now, imagine the parish register, its pages filled with names carefully inked line after line. Some were honored, some forgotten, some burdened by labels they never chose. But in the end, each name belonged to a life, ordinary, imperfect, and worthy of remembrance. And in that truth, you may find a gentler understanding that what matters most is not the title one inherits, but the quiet dignity with which a person carries it through the world. You were sometimes branded as a bastard. No name meant no future for your children. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a village just as evening settles. The last light of the sun softens the outlines of thatched roofs and wattle fences. Smoke drifts slowly from cottage chimneys, carrying the scent of peat and drying herbs. From the outside, it looks as though every household belongs here, each with a place secured by habit and time. But not every door you pass belongs to a family whose place is certain. In some of these cottages, there is no lineage recorded in parish rolls, no deed tucked away in a chest, no ancestral story told by the hearth. For those who lived without a name recognized by the community, life itself was an exercise in uncertainty. And for their children, the consequences stretched far beyond the present. In a world where status and opportunity depended on family ties, having no documented name was a kind of invisible poverty. Names were more than labels. They were passports to trust, to trade, to marriage, and to land. A known name could open the door to an apprenticeship, or secure a promise of protection from a local lord. A child born to a nameless parent entered life without any of these assurances. Imagine a small boy sitting near the fire, listening as his mother tries to soothe him with stories. But her tales contain no familiar ancestors, no mention of a grandfather who held land, no unbroken line to point toward pride. She can tell him she loves him, that he is clever and good, but she cannot offer the safety of a recognized heritage. When the time came for this boy to begin working, he would find that every opportunity required something he did not have. To apprentice with a blacksmith, he needed a patron to vouch for him. To join a guild, he needed proof of his father's name. Even to marry respectably, he needed a surname that showed he belonged to someone, somewhere. The rhythm of these disappointments was quiet, but relentless. A knock on the door, a hopeful inquiry, a pause while the steward or the master weighed the absence of credentials. Then the same gentle refusal. Perhaps next season, or I am sorry, but it is not possible. Over time, a child learned to stop asking. Without a recognized name, land was out of reach. Even if a family managed to save enough to lease a small plot, their claim could be challenged at any time. Neighbors with longer histories in the village would always have the stronger position in a dispute. If a harvest failed or a lord demanded higher rent, there was no foundation to fall back upon. No inherited rights, no alliances to intercede. Imagine the quiet determination it took to keep going despite this. A mother rising before dawn to bake coarse bread. A father mending tools by firelight, both knowing that whatever they managed to build could be taken as easily as it was earned. And when their children grew, the cycle began again. No inheritance to pass down, no alliances to secure a better future. The absence of a name was also the absence of memory. In villages where families measured their history in generations, those who came with nothing were simply called newcomers. Their stories, their struggles, their small triumphs were seldom recorded. When they died, the parish clerk might write only a first name, if that. No father's lineage, no mother's surname, no note of where they had come from. Over time, some tried to change this by crafting names for themselves. A man might take the name of his trade, carter, smith, tanner, hoping that over time the designation would become an identity. But such claims could be fragile. Without land or the approval of local authorities, the name might never fully stick. Children born to these families still carried the shadow of origin. Who were they really? Where did they come from? Imagine the small humiliations that accumulated over a lifetime. The way a priest hesitated before writing a christening entry, the knowing glances when a marriage contract was prepared, the whispered doubts about whether a claim to property or respect could be trusted. These were wounds that did not bleed but left their mark all the same. And yet, in the midst of all this, there was a quiet endurance. Families without names built lives out of the materials at hand. Day labor, seasonal work, the goodwill of a few sympathetic neighbors. They found ways to endure winter and to mark the milestones of their children's lives, even if no chronicler would remember them. When you picture that village at dusk, look for the small cottage near the edge of the fields. The light within is no less warm for the absence of lineage. A mother lifts her child onto her lap, and in that moment, she gives what she can. The certainty of love, the promise to keep trying, the hope that one day, the child's name might mean something more. As you drift toward reflection or rest, consider how many generations built their lives in the shadow of such quiet disadvantages. No inheritance, no alliances, no memory recorded in ink. Yet they worked, they hoped, and they loved with a persistence that deserves remembrance. In the rhythm of their days, you can see a testament to human resilience. The determination to create something from nothing, to offer children a chance, however fragile, to claim a place in a world that so often denied them one. You were not allowed to own a trademark or seal. Imagine yourself in a narrow medieval workshop, the first light of morning slipping through a high, unglazed window. The air is cool and tinged with a scent of damp wood shavings, iron filings, and a faint trace of lamp oil. On the long bench, small tools are neatly laid out. Chisels, awls, and simple branding irons that will heat over the coals before pressing their marks into finished wares. In this world, a mark was more than a flourish. For tradesmen, it was proof of authorship and a small defense against the ever-present risk of imitation. A seal carved into the handle of a spade or stamped onto the base of a clay pot said, "This was made by my hands." It was an identifier as important as a signature. But to have a mark registered, you first needed a recognized surname, an established place in the social order. For those who began life without a family name, this system created a quiet barrier. Without a surname, you were effectively excluded from the protections that other craftsmen took for granted. Imagine a young man who had trained for years under a cooper, learning the subtle art of shaping staves and binding them tight with iron hoops. When he finally struck out on his own, his barrels could be copied by any rival. If a dissatisfied buyer claimed the barrels were poorly made, he had no official mark to defend his reputation. Picture him standing before the guild elders in the dim hall that served as both meeting chamber and record room. The walls are hung with faded banners displaying the registered emblems of dozens of local tradesmen. A wheel for the cartwright, a sheaf of arrows for the fletcher, a stylized shoe for the cobbler. Each symbol belongs to a name, a family, a lineage. But when the young cooper petitions for his own seal, the clerk shakes his head with gentle finality. No surname means no mark. The rules are clear. This restriction was not merely a technicality. In an age when few could read, the mark or seal was the primary way to distinguish the work of one craftsman from another. It appeared on documents, wax seals, and wooden templates. It was impressed into soft clay or cut into metal before a piece left the shop. Without it, your work slipped into anonymity. Imagine a customer carrying away a set of wooden bowls, each one shaped and smoothed by hand, but unmarked. If those bowls cracked or split, there would be no emblem to identify who had made them. And if they held up well and earned praise, there was no way to ensure the credit returned to the hands that fashioned them. For children and young adults without surnames, The problem was compounded by limited access to guild membership. Guilds did not simply protect wages and standards. They also upheld the right to claim authorship and defend it in court if needed. If you had no family name, you often lacked the standing to testify fully in your own defense. It was easier, in these circumstances, for competitors to appropriate designs, mimic methods, or pass off inferior goods as yours. Yet many nameless craftsmen persisted. Imagine a blacksmith's apprentice, grown to maturity, forging simple tools in a small rented stall at the edge of town. Each morning, he lights the coals and begins the steady work of hammering iron into useful shapes. He knows that anyone can walk by, take note of the patterns he favors, the curve of a blade, the set of a hinge, and recreate them elsewhere. Still, he rises before dawn and works until dusk, trusting that skill will speak for itself, even without a seal. Over time, some craftsmen manage to acquire surnames by other means. By marrying into a family, by saving enough to buy property, or by establishing a reputation so solid that the community began to call them by a name derived from their trade. John, once just the Turner, might become John Turner in the parish records, and with that name, finally earn the right to register a mark. But such a path was neither swift nor guaranteed. Imagine the quiet frustration of knowing that each finished piece could be claimed by others, that your livelihood rested not only on your ability, but on the willingness of customers to remember who you were. For some, this struggle became part of the rhythm of life, an unspoken reality that no amount of skill could entirely erase. Yet even in these circumstances, moments of dignity and perseverance endured. Picture the blacksmith pausing at the close of day to examine a completed latch. He turns it over in his hands, feeling the weight of his own labor. Though no official seal marks it as his, he recognizes the small details, the way the iron curves just so, the precise finish on the hinge. These subtle signatures belong to him alone. When you think of the past, let yourself linger on these quiet realities. The workshop where a young cooper waited patiently for recognition. The market stalls where nameless craftsmen laid out their goods, hoping buyers would remember their faces if not their names. The slow, steady work of those who, denied a mark, left traces of themselves in every careful curve and join. In this way, history reminds us that recognition was never distributed evenly. For those without the privilege of a surname, the road to legitimacy was longer and more uncertain. But their persistence is a testament to something enduring. The belief that skill and dedication could carve out a place, even when the official records refused to grant it. And so, the story of craftsmen without seals is not only a tale of exclusion, it is also a story of quiet resilience, of hands that shaped wood, metal, and clay into something lasting, even when no mark proclaimed their worth.